having a non-electric mechanical backup for water gets you squared away, gives you some redundancy, and you know that if all else fails, at least you can get water out of that hole in the ground. And that's super important.
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Lisa Meisner.
And I'm Nick, her husband.
Welcome back to the Ready Life podcast, where you're going to learn how to become more independent for your basic necessities like water, heat, food, and unfortunately, the power that we've all come to depend on. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the three most basic necessities of life. Power is just become a basic necessity, but it isn't actually. You can live without it. But today we're going to be talking about water, specifically a hand pump on your well. You know, we've mentioned this in previous podcasts that if you have a well, you should also have a hand pump on that well.
Every well needs a hand pump.
That's right. And the reason is simple, because while power is wonderful to have, and we rely on it for many of our basic necessities, sometimes it just gives out, and you need to have water. You can live without power, but you cannot live without water. And that's why we urge the necessity that every well should have a hand pump on it.
And even if you have a off-grid solar power system like we do, which is very reliable and we can make our own power completely independently, even if you have that kind of a situation to power your water pump, I still think that having a hand pump on there is a really good backup because redundancy is really important with basic necessities of life. Water pumps, even though they're very reliable, they can still fail. And even your power equipment in your off-grid solar power system, if you set up a good system, quality system that's set up properly, it should be very reliable. But even still, anything man-made can fail. And so having a non-electric mechanical backup for water gets you squared away, gives you some redundancy, and you know that if all else fails, at least you can get water out of that hole in the ground. And that's super important. What do you need to know beforehand in order to figure out if a hand pump is possible and which one and all that sort of thing? Well, there's three big things that you need to know about. One is the static water level, and that is basically how far from the surface the water is. And we're not talking about the overall depth of the well. We're talking how far down to the water, because your well could be 300 feet deep, but the static water level may only be 100 feet. And so that's really important because that's going to be the critical factor that determines whether a hand pump is a feasible option for getting water out of the ground. Because if the static water level is too deep, then a hand pump may not be able to pump water out of the ground. So 325 feet is the absolute maximum that is considered feasible to do with a hand pump. At that depth, you're very limited in your options. It's going to be harder. You'll get less water per stroke. So it's far from ideal, but it's at least possible down to 325 feet. The shallower your static water level is, the better, because you've got more options. You can get more water per stroke and less effort and things like this, and more options in which hand pump you can choose. So static water level is super important. Another one is the diameter of the casing. And we're talking about the well casing, that goes down, they drill a hole, and then generally there's going to be some sort of casing to prevent cave-ins in your well. And so 6 inches is pretty typical in most parts of the country for the casing, and that's best. If you've got 6-inch casing, then no sweat. A hand pump, that checks that box for a hand pump being possible with your well. But even if your casing necks down to 4-inch casing, it still may be possible. It's just your options are going to be a little bit more limited, and you'd need to talk with the hand pump manufacturer and see what options they have that would work with your situation. But just so you have an idea of what are what's ideal and what's possible. And then also the yield of the well, how many gallons per minute. That one we normally think of as being more of a factor with a electric pump. When you're looking at using a well as your primary water source, you want to have at least, 5 gallons a minute is kind of considered the gold standard. Well, with a hand pump, it's not as important because you're not pumping very fast. 5 gallons a minute, yes, in the right scenario, if it was a really shallow static water level and you put a really big hand pump on there that can pump a lot per stroke and you really worked at it, I'm sure you could get up to that much or more maybe. But in most scenarios, a hand pump is not going to be pumping that fast. So I'm not as concerned about the yield of a well when we're looking at the hand pump. The biggest thing to me is static water level and then the diameter of the casing. And then the other thing, I mentioned 3 things, but there's also a 4th that is a factor, and that is if there's any obstructions in your well that would prevent you from being able to put a hand pump down into that well. And this could come in a variety of forms, but the most common type of obstruction would be a well cap that is not one that's workable. And the hand pump manufacturer, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it just depends upon, every scenario is unique. And across the country, they use so many different types of arrangements and types of well plugs on the top. When I say well plug, I'm talking about the cap up on the top of the casing. But there are some caps that go on casing that would be difficult to deal with a hand pump. Just to give you a hint as to the most common one that would be more challenging is a split cap, and it's basically where it's a cap that fits inside of the casing and it's split in half, so there's 2 halves, and the pipe that's coming from your electric pump comes out the top of that cap and exits and goes over to your house. So those are more challenging to deal with. I'm not saying impossible. You can still do it. It's just going to take more work. Potentially, you might have to change some things around. So the most ideal setup is pitless adapter going out the side of the well. If there's a pitless adapter, I think the most common type of arrangement these days, which is where the pipe is coming up through the casing and then several feet underground, it turns 90 degrees and goes out the side of the casing and heads underground over to your house. A pitless adapter that's over to the side of the casing like that is the ideal scenario for a hand pump, because then what you're looking for is, do I have enough space to lower a 3-inch or 2-inch or 1.5-inch cylinder down into the well to get down to the water? That's really what I'm looking for, is there enough space or are there obstructions in the way?
What about wires? What if I'm able to look into my well, but I see a whole bunch of wires in the way?
Well, wires can generally be moved around. Hopefully it's not a big mess. If it's a big mess, then you might want to get that cleaned up, just because it's not really a good idea to have a whole spider's web of wires in there, and it could get things hung up. But wires are flexible. They can move around and move into small spaces. But it's things like the pitless adapter or things like a torque arrestor, which basically centers the pipe up. It's a round disc that has a hole in the middle and keeps the pipe in the middle of the well. That would be something that would need to be removed.
That would block it.
Yeah. Now, if that torque arrestor is down near the pump and the pump is near the bottom of the well and you've got 100 feet of water above that torque arrestor, no sweat, because we're only going to go 20 feet or so below the water level with our hand pump. So this is something that you may not realize in your well. It's, you've got, so let's go back to the example I used of a 300-foot well with a 100-foot static water level. That means you've got 200 feet of water in there. You might think that your electric pump is right near the surface, but it's not. At least it shouldn't be. If the well pump guy did his job right, he should have put the pump down near the bottom, not at the bottom, but not too far off the bottom, so that now you've got almost 200 feet of water sitting on top of it. And if you pump the water level down, it's got some reserve on top of it. And so what that does is it gives you plenty of space where your pump is way down here and you've got 200 feet of water, and all we need is about 20 feet of water on top of the hand pump. And the only reason we need that is so that if the static water level fluctuates some, we've got, it can go down 15 or 18 feet before we're running into trouble with the hand pump.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. Yeah. So where would we start? How would we find out some of this information about our well?
So the easiest place is the well log. And it's not necessarily the most accurate, but it is the easiest for sure. And it's the best place to start. I mean, that's your best place to get a rough idea, at least, of is my well even a possible candidate for a hand pump.
So a well log is basically the form or paperwork that the well driller filled out when they first dug the well. So they wrote down how deep the well is, where the static water is roughly, and how many gallons per minute on the well.
And often things like the diameter of the casing, at what depth they set the pump. Often there's all kinds of useful info on there. And so each state is a little different in how you find your well log. But if you can find it, it's a treasure trove of information. And I had the hardest time for years, telling folks, well, I'm not sure how you find your well log. You'll have to call the county health department or something like that. But finally, I just did a whole bunch of research and researched for every state and made a list of all 50 states, whatever I was able to find regarding how to find your well log in that state. And you can actually download that for free. If you go to thereadylife.com/find log, that's FINDLOG for find your well log, thereadylife.com/FINDLOG, find log, and you can download it for free, and that'll give you the list for all 50 states of whatever I'm aware of for each of those states regarding how to find your well log. And that'll give you a good estimate to get started, and that's the best place to start. But beyond that, before you actually sink money into this, I highly recommend that you physically check your static water level now, because things change over time. And your static water level can change, especially if the well was drilled 15, 20, 30 years ago. A lot can change in that time. And so you don't really want to sink money into this until you know for sure where it is. And so you can do that with some really thin rope or fishing line or something like that, with something that has a little bit of weight tied to the end of it, something that won't get tangled up. You want it to be small, but have a little weight to it, and you don't want anything that has hooks on it or anything like that could get caught in wires. You want it to be smooth. For instance, like a nut that screws onto a bolt could be a good possible option. Something like that you can very carefully drop down in there until you hear it go kerplunk. When you hear that, then mark your line and pull it up and measure it, and that'll tell you how far down to the water. And you want to do that when the pump has been off for several hours. If you do that right away while the pump is running or right after the pump turns off, it's not going to give you a very accurate reading.
So first thing in the morning before you run water.
Right. So that'll give you your static water level. And then as far as the yield, like I said, I'm not as concerned about the yield. You've probably got a good idea of it now. And if it's able to keep up with your electric pump, you're definitely not going to have any issues with the hand pump. If it's a really sketchy well, I mean, you should already know what it is. But if for some reason you didn't know, then you could always do a pump test with an electric pump. But I kind of feel like that's overkill with a hand pump.
Yeah.
We're not as concerned about the yield. As long as it can give off, a gallon a minute or so, then it should be just fine. And even with that, I mean, how long are you going to be pumping at one time?
That's true.
So, what about, we talked about obstructions, which was one thing that I wanted to make sure about, because that's something that you don't hear much about.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of people that have gotten into a hand pump just to find that they
They
couldn't get
get
it
it
down,
down.
and then they had to bring in professional help to help clear out those obstructions or whatever. Which brings up our next point, which is, should you do this yourself or hire an installer? And that's it. Really, a lot of it depends upon you, how handy you are. If you're a pretty handy person and you want to save some money, then a hand pump installation is often quite feasible to do. There are a few situations where I would recommend against it. One would be, I mentioned earlier about a split cap for the well,
yes.
where it's got two halves in the middle,
And the pipe comes out
and
the
the pipe
middle.
comes out the top, and this cap is inside the casing, and it's got a seal around the outside. With this split cap, what's happening is that split cap is holding the weight of the whole pipeline, because the pipeline, the water pipe comes up, and then generally it's going to turn off to the side, and the weight of that whole pipeline and the pump is hanging on that split cap, and it's challenging without the right equipment to get that loose without losing part of the split cap down the well or dropping the pump, or any number of things can happen. So if you know what you're doing and you're comfortable dealing with that, that's one thing. But if you don't, I would recommend getting a professional with that kind of a scenario. Or if your static water level is, say, plus or minus 150 feet or deeper, then it's going to get pretty heavy, letting the pipe down. Especially pulling an old hand pump out of the well is going to be really difficult at that depth, because it's going to be full of water. Letting it down is easier because it's not full of water at that point. It's empty. It's just air in the pipe. So you're just dealing with the weight of the pipe and the cylinder down at the bottom. And I've done down to about 120 feet, and it was had some weight to it, but with 2 or 3 guys, it was totally feasible. And so that's why I say somewhere 150 feet is kind of where I'd draw my line, and want to bring in a professional who's got a boom or a crane or something where they can, let machinery do the heavy lifting for them.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. But those are a couple of scenarios that come to my mind. But beyond that, it's not that difficult to install a hand pump. It can typically be done in one day. It's not tricky at all. You don't have to, as a general rule, you don't have to pull the electric pump. You can just leave it there, and you're just adding something to your well. You're not pulling anything out, unless you've got one of those split caps or something that requires you to pull the electric pump in order to get the hand pump in there. But anyhow, that's what I would say. And they've both got their pros and cons.
So what are the different types of hand pumps that you'd recommend?
By the way, before we leave installers, I just was thinking, how do you find an installer? And the best thing I know, of course, you can ask around local plumbing supply house or call well drillers. Sometimes, especially in our area at least, well drillers will often, be willing to install a hand pump. But for more options, if you go to, and this kind of leads into your question of brands, I was going to mention a couple of brands, the Bison hand pump and the Simple pump. Both of them on their websites have a dealer locator, and it'll also tell dealers who are installers. And so not everybody who's on there is going to be an installer. Some of them are just going to be dealers, but a lot of them are installers as well. And so that can be a great option for trying to locate. It's
a great resource.
Installer.
Even if you're not going to use the Bison or the Simple pump, you can still get on there and kind of look around and see which ones are listed as installers, and then call them up and say, hey, I have this other pump. Would you be willing to come and install it?
Right. That's right. And so then, as far as, before we get into brands though, the type of hand pump, there's 2 main types of hand pumps. There's the deep well hand pump and a shallow well hand pump. And a deep well hand pump, you'll never imagine, but it's for deep
wells that have a deep static water
level. And we're talking 25 feet or greater. as a general rule.
And you're not talking about the overall depth of well. You're just talking about the
level.
static water level.
Exactly.
That's why you need to know what that static water level is first.
That's right. And so the definition as far as hand pumps goes of a deep well is going to be deeper than 25 feet to the static water level. And the reason for that is that you can only suction water so far, and a shallow well hand pump is operating totally on the principle of suction. Just think of a straw, that you put a long straw down in a cup and try and suck water up. You can only suck it so far. And so there are limitations to how far you can suction. 25 feet, not all shallow well hand pumps can do that, but the very best ones can go down to 25 feet at sea level and subtract 1 foot for every 1,000 feet of altitude. So if you're at 3,000 feet of altitude, then figure an absolute maximum of 22 feet. And that would be from the hand pump to the static water level. So if your hand pump is 5 feet above ground level, then that means
you have to add that into the total.
To the equation, exactly. So so that's what we're talking about when we say deep well, shallow well. Now, shallow well hand pumps have some advantages in that they can be potentially less expensive, and it can be easier to install. You don't have to do anything inside your well with a shallow hand pump. You can just tap into your existing plumbing, the pipeline that's coming from your electric submersible pump. You can tap into that, and it'll suck the water up through that pipe. So it has some real advantages there, and they can be potentially less expensive overall. But if your static water level's deeper, then you're going to have to go deep well hand pump, and that's the only option. So that's the difference between those two. Now, getting to
the brands. I'm ready to buy my hand pump.
That's right. So Bison, I already mentioned them. They're in my opinion, the heaviest duty pump and also the most expensive. And so if you want the best and you're willing to pay for it, that's a really nice option. Stainless steel all the way down, can handle fairly deep static water levels, and just a really nice, really sturdy option. And they make both deep well hand pumps and shallow well hand pumps. Simple pump is also a nice option. They're mostly stainless steel, but they do use some lighter weight fiberglass parts for the pump rod, which lightens everything up, and they are able to pump from the deepest static water level with the least amount of effort. So if you have a really deep static water level, I'm going to kind of steer you in the direction of the simple pump. And they're reasonably heavy duty. I don't feel like they're as heavy duty as the Bison, but they're still good quality and nothing to laugh about for sure. And they are less expensive than the Bison. So that's a nice kind of middle of the road pump that a lot of folks go with. And then last on my short list of the best pumps is the Baker Monitor, which is the old clunky cast iron hand pumps that you see in state parks a lot and things like that. The green
ones that last forever.
Yeah, they go and go and go. They're tough as nails, built like a tank, but they're not ideal for really deep static water levels. They're best for, 100 feet or less. Not to say that they can't go deeper. They can, but
it's just more work.
When you're comparing them with the other pumps, they're not the ideal solution when you get down deeper than 100 feet or so. But the other thing that I have, the other challenge that you might run into with them is they don't sell direct to the public. And so you have to go through a dealer or a wholesaler or something like that, which means you're generally going to have to find a installer that sells the Baker Monitor, and that's going to be the best way to go with them. They don't have hardly any material out there for the end user, so figuring out how they want it installed and how to any use items or things like this, you're just going to kind of be fending for yourself. It's not made that way. They've really made it for professionals to install. And so it's not going to be a very user-friendly experience to do that on your own. But it's a great pump for shallow or static water levels. But I like the Bison and the simple pump for most folks that are, especially if you're going to do it yourself, because they're really set up for that. They ship everything to you, and you just put it together. They've got videos that show you exactly how to put their pump together and walk you through it and everything. So that's a nice option.
Yeah.
And one other that I might mention is if you are on a really, really tight budget and you are not at all looking for a high quality pump or a top of the line pump, you're okay with a emergency pump, something that you would only use for a little while in an emergency. And maybe this was your only option for getting a hand pump, then there is something, if your static water level is like 100 feet or less, the Apocalypse pump. I've actually seen those in person, and I think they're not a gimmick. They're for real. No, they're not made out of the same kind of materials that some of your higher quality pumps are. They're like PVC all the way up, except I think the pump rod is stainless, but the pump itself is made out of a high-grade PVC. It's not just regular PVC, so it's not going to fall apart right away, but it's just not as beefy and heavy-duty as the others. But that's another option that's quite a bit less expensive than the three good ones that I mentioned. But there's a bunch of options out there, and we actually are putting together a course in the Ready Life Academy on hand pumps.
That's
coming
right.
out with it shortly. That's going to walk you through step by step, figuring out which is the best pump in your situation and all of the details that you need to know, and just kind of walking you step by step through this process and answering your questions and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, where you'll actually get support through the process instead of just trying to figure it out on your own, going through the school of hard knocks.
That's right. Right. But your first step really in this whole process is to find your well log. And so once again, I would just direct you to thereadylifecom/find log, FINDLOG, to see if your well is even an option. And then next, get solid info on your static water level. Remember, I talked about very carefully dropping a little something down attached to a string to figure that out. And then you can get a quote from some companies and compare. I would get more than one quote. If you're going to do it yourself, then get a quote from Bison and Simple, and or whatever options you choose. Get at least a couple of quotes. And if you're looking at having it done for you, try and get a couple of quotes so that you have something to compare with.
Yeah.
And it's and if you're looking for an installer, like I mentioned, the Bison hand pumps or the Simple Pump website, they have a dealer locator, and we'll link to all that stuff in the description.
That's right.
So that's a little bit about hand pumps. I know we got into some real meaty details there, maybe, and I think that this is going to be a good start to get you headed in the right direction with hand pumps, and I hope it's been super helpful to you, because every well needs a hand pump.
That's right. That's right. So go get one on your well.
That's right. We'll see y'all later.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.